In this video, we're going to be looking at three of the key concepts that we're going to be exploring throughout the course. The first is inclusion, which is, of course, the topic of the first chapter that you will be reading or you have read in the Ryan text. Exclusion, which is of course, the reverse side of the notion of inclusion, and what we might mean by the term social justice, because this is something that will be explored in many of the readings that we're going to be looking at. So we'll begin thinking about what that expression might mean, and particularly what that might mean for leadership in schools and for schooling in general. So let's look first at the author of the text. Jim Ryan is a professor at the University of Toronto at OISE, which is the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and he was one of my professors and continues to be a friend. His work has, right from the beginning of his professorship, and I think probably his work as a teacher prior to that, focused around notions of social justice. How is it that we can create inclusive schools, inclusive classrooms, and think about leadership in an inclusive way? So as you look through, if you have a chance to look through some of his writing in journals, as well as the pretty substantial series of books that he's done over his time as a professor, you will notice a common theme, and that will be around inclusivity, and particularly inclusivity as it relates to leadership. In this little series of pictures that are on the website that I stole this from, or took this from, you'll see some of the people that he works with. He and some others have set up a kind of an institute around diversity and leadership, and some of those people have been involved in the research that he uses as examples throughout the text that you'll be reading. So I introduce you to Jim Ryan as a colleague and as a friend, and as a scholar whose work I certainly admire and has been taken up in many other settings as well. So in the first chapter that you'll have read or you'll be reading, he talks about this notion of inclusive leadership, and essentially in this first chapter he builds a case towards inclusive leadership. And he begins by talking about exclusion. That is, what is this notion of exclusion? How do we experience it? How do we experience it in our everyday lives as people, as friends, as co-workers, as leaders in schools, and so on? How does that play itself out? And how has it played itself out throughout our lives? And we can all give examples of times in which we have felt excluded based on characteristics or situations that we had really no control over, but have been taken up by others as a way to exclude us, even if it's kind of temporarily. So teasing might be an example of that. But bullying is a much more detrimental form of exclusion. And then he talks about why it's important to understand this notion of exclusion and inclusion as educators and as leaders in schools. And I'll leave this question for you, as I will some of the questions as we go through this presentation or this little mini lecture, talking about what is it about these concepts that is important for us as educators to understand. He argues that one of the most damaging forms of exclusion rather, and one that we need to be particularly aware of as teachers, as administrators, as educators in schools, and as community members for that matter, is the kind of exclusion that is experienced repeatedly and is reinforced systemically. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we mean by that those processes that keep exclusion in place. And throughout the course, we'll be talking about examples of how this happens. Tilley, a sociologist from the United States, wrote a book called Durable Inequalities, in which he explores the particular forms of exclusion around particular characteristics that have tended In fact, we can think of many examples around us, if you pick up any newspaper today, around these particular kind of inequalities that hold particular groups of the population in place, and makes it very difficult for them to move outside of the effects of that exclusion. So some of those characteristics would be around race, gender, class, sexual identity, ability or disability, and religion. Language we could include in there as well as one of the ways in which exclusion works systemically to ensure that certain groups enjoy certain kinds of advantages and other groups have less access to those advantages. So Ryan talks about that, and then he talks about what we might mean by inclusive leadership. What are the characteristics of inclusive leadership that will help push against the forms of exclusion that he talks about and that we've been talking about in this video? Well, first of all, he talks about inclusive leadership as a collective influence process that promotes inclusion, and it's inclusive in two ways. First of all, the processes of leadership are inclusive, and this little picture demonstrates the ways in which leadership might be an inclusive process, in the sense that many people are involved in the process of bringing together information, making decisions, etc., in a very real way. Now, we've all experienced, probably most of us have experienced times when we have been asked for our opinion, and then it has been promptly neglected or excluded from the decision-making process. That isn't what he's talking about. He's talking about trying to bring together multiple ideas, perspectives, and then working together through particular kinds of processes to ensure that that becomes part of the decision-making process. So that means that we need to, inclusive leaders need to promote inclusive practices, and those practices include inclusion, social justice, and democracy in school, community, and the wider society, and the activities that those groups engage in. So as an example of this in education, and pardon me, I've got a tickle in my throat and I'm going to have to take a drink of water every once in a while. So for example, how does Beacon Elementary demonstrate these two characteristics of inclusive leadership? I'll leave that as a question for you to think about, and you might want to take that up in the forum to some degree. But there are ways in which it does, and arguably there are ways in which it doesn't as well. And of course, this is always a process that we're working towards. But Ryan argues that there is a moral obligation, pardon me, particularly true for education, that everyone is included fairly, socially, culturally, economically, and politically. Now we're talking about a much broader notion of society, but as education represents that broader notion of society in a more, I guess, a smaller way, almost as a kind of bringing together of those characteristics in a smaller setting, then we can think then of inclusive leadership wherein everyone has the right to participate in what the world has to offer and to reap the benefits of this involvement. And after all, isn't that what we're trying to do as educators? So why isn't this the norm? If we accept the arguments that Ryan has put forward, and not everyone will, and he even gives examples of those who don't, but certainly from his perspective, this should be the norm, and some of us in this class will agree and others may not. So the question then becomes, why isn't this the norm? And probably most of us could answer that question if we really sought out more deeply why it is that inclusion isn't the way in which we organize our lives, organize our professional lives and our personal lives and our collective lives politically. Well, he argues that there's a reluctance to acknowledge and confront exclusion. And there are multiple ways in which we can think of, small and large, in which that that reluctance is enacted, especially as racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, ableism, and so on are so deeply entrenched in the everyday practices in schools and communities. And many of the readings that we're going to be looking at start to kind of unearth or disentangle the ways in which this happens. Often not intentionally, sometimes intentionally, but often not intentionally, but simply by enacting the norms in which we have grown up, the norms that we have come to accept as reality, because it fits with our reality. When that happens, then these kinds of actions take place. So for example, in terms of policy and the practices of the schools, standardized testing, by its very name, suggests that it's accepting a particular kind of standard. The critical question then becomes, well, where do those standards come from? Whose standards do they reinscribe? Whose standards do they exclude? And whenever we talk about any kind of standard, for example, then we automatically are talking about both a form of inclusion and exclusion. So he raises some interesting questions around standardized testing and what it excludes and what it includes. The hidden curriculum, the ways in which the things that we do every day, girls line up here, boys line up there, pretty innocuous kinds of things that keep reinscribing particular norms of society that then inscribe particular forms of sexism, racism, and so on. The kinds of curriculum choices that we make, and we'll be talking about that more as the video goes along. What's there? I mean, these are critical questions that we need to continually ask ourselves. What's there and what isn't there? And the other question then becomes why? So if this isn't the norm that we desire, then what's the antidote? And Ryan argues that the antidote is inclusive leadership. What then stands in the way of enacting inclusive leadership? Well, there are certain kinds of systemic barriers that stand in the way. One of them is certainly the ways in which organizations are organized around particular kinds of hierarchies. So the responsibility of a principal at the apex of the hierarchy within the school, not of course within the larger educational organization, but certainly within the school, means then that person who occupies that position has not only primary power, however you want to describe that, and that's a whole other discussion that we may have throughout the course, but also has the primary responsibility. So that excessive responsibility of an individual means that it's very difficult then for that individual to be inclusive of others in dispersing responsibility, because what if somebody messes up? Then that person at the top is going to be the one who takes the flak, so to speak. So this is one way in which norms are kept in place by the very systems that we are a part of. Leadership is also constrained by expectations within formal positions of authority. So those expectations are, as we've already discovered, very much tied to the individual rather than the collective. So we have these very individualistic models of leadership versus collective models of leadership. And even those collective models of leadership that exist, often the primary responsibility, the buck stops, so to speak, with the individual who holds that position. So that makes it difficult then for a principal or for someone in a position of authority to share that responsibility. Participatory decision making is difficult as well within instrumental systems, and even though we may say that that's what's happening, because those systems are so instrumentalized, that is, they're attached to particular kinds of goals with particular kinds of reporting mechanisms and so on, then it makes it very difficult for someone to kind of move outside of those kinds of constraints. So within that participatory participatory decision making within instrumental systems, the ends then end up being ones that are system driven rather than group driven. So these kind of systemic barriers are in place, and that makes inclusion more difficult, not impossible, and recognizing that those restraints are there or constraints are there is a part of understanding how we might then think outside of those constraints to be more inclusive. So what is inclusion then? Well, Ryan, I think, has a very good definition that he takes from Blaze and Anderson, and he says, in rewording it, one way to think about inclusion in social situations, and of course education is a social situation, if there ever was one, is to consider the type of access people get to societal systems. To what extent do men, women, and children have access to social, economic, political, or cultural systems? To participation in decision-making and political processes, to employment and material resources, and to common cultural processes like education. This raises a very, very important question, and I'll leave you to kind of think about what that question, how you might take up that question or how you might understand that question in your particular context. And again, I would invite you to consider that in the forum and think through the ways in which inclusion is demonstrated or not in the social situations in which you find yourself, particularly in the schooling setting in which you are engaged. Oh, I didn't add a title here. But inclusion is not a new concept in education. It's one that we've talked about for generations now, actually, because it often was associated with concepts of special needs, exceptional and differently abled students. And I can remember a large discussion back in the 60s and early 70s when it was proposed that those children who had been excluded from, and I put in quotation marks, regular classrooms, now be included in those same classrooms. And what that meant, both in terms of labeling students, what that meant in terms of teacher practice, what that meant in terms of the supports that were necessary, and so on. And what that meant for students who had been excluded in separate locations, in being included now in again, air quotes, a normal classroom. So, and there's a whole range of discussion around that that I won't get into now, but it certainly, inclusion has been a part of the discussion and part of the understanding around educational opportunities for many, many years. But more recently, the notion has been expanded to include all students. So, much more differentiated instruction, that sort of thing. So we're thinking much more individually about students. But particularly, we're thinking about those students who are excluded from the knowledge, experiences, and interactions that schools favor. And that favoring, of course, comes from the norms that are set within the dominant society, even when they're physically present. So a student may be sitting in a classroom but feel totally separated or at least partially separated from the learning experiences taking place because their form of knowledge, their experiences, their interactions have not been included in the kinds of discussions and curriculum opportunities that are available in that classroom. Much of the discussion, for example, with the new curriculum in BC has been around inclusion of Aboriginal perspectives in the classroom and in the curriculum of the classroom. And this is a subject that warrants a lot of discussion, and we'll get into that more as we get further into the course. One of my students in my previous class is taking that up as her project and is doing some remarkable work, as are others, in looking at what this might look like and what needs to be done in order for this to be done effectively. So, so this notion has been expanded in ways that are challenging and yet exciting too, in terms of what we might offer some students who have been traditionally pretty seriously neglected in our classrooms, and the statistics would bear that out. So what are the characteristics of inclusive leadership then? First of all, ideally, first of all, it is influence. So characteristics of inclusive leadership are around the influence that people exercise. So ideally, I put IL here just because it gets tiresome to keep putting inclusive leadership, so I apologize. But inclusive leadership provides everyone with a fair chance to influence decisions, practices, and policies. And we've talked about what that might look like, and we'll be talking about that more in the future as well. It's a characteristic of inclusive leadership is also around the processes that are engaged in, where the inclusive leader relies on many individuals who contribute to a clearly established process over time. And I emphasize a clearly established process here because we're not just talking about kind of willy-nilly, laissez-faire, everybody chat, but we are talking about people who have come together and have decided on processes by which to which they agree and in which they will be fully engaged. So it's a process that has been discussed and is understood. And I think that's important, and it's part of the process of inclusive leadership, is coming to that place with the voices that need to be a part of the discussion. And over time is an important one as well in terms of the sustainability of this model of leadership, because over time this group of people then needs to be able to share the knowledge that they've gained with others who will be taken into this process over time, including new leaders who come into the school. So that leadership shifts, depending on, I'm not sure what that word is, but I think it's new available knowledge and circumstances, are able to retain and maintain the momentum of the leadership that has been provided. And it's in leadership that is organized to achieve a particular end. It's not just any end to be achieved by leadership, because if that were the case, then Hitler was a successful leader. He got done what he intended to do. And that isn't what we're talking about, but particular end is a moral end, and that is inclusion. So some questions to think about after reading Chapter 1 include: what forms of exclusion have you observed in your own experience and in the experience of those in your classroom and schools? What kinds of actions might be taken to resist that exclusion? What kinds of examples have you actually seen? Do you see examples of inclusive leadership in your practice? And if so, describe what that looks like. And if you don't see examples, what does exclusive leadership look like, and what might need to be changed to make it inclusive? Keeping in mind that inclusive leadership is always a process, like any other form of leadership. It's always something that is becoming. Is inclusive leadership a worthy goal? Is it an attainable goal? Why or why not? And certainly these are the things that we need to be thinking about as we think about what inclusive leadership might actually look like. Well, the other side, of course, of inclusion is exclusion, and some call exclusion oppression, oppressing the possibilities of the students and those who are not able to participate fully in the activities of society. So Deirdre Kelly, the second reading that you were asked to look at, and I will try to wrap this up quickly. I know that this is getting long. The first one always is a little bit longer than the others. Deirdre Kelly, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia in Children and Youth Studies, Gender Studies, Social Justice Studies, and so on, has written an interesting article looking at the experiences of pre-service teachers who have been educated in social justice studies and are then going out into the classrooms and are working towards achieving an expression of the things that they've been learning about. And she organizes her article around an article by Iris Young, who stresses that oppression is a condition of groups and designates the disadvantage and injustice some people suffer not because a tyrannical power coerces them, but because of the everyday practices of a well-intentioned liberal society. And this is, to me, a very powerful and challenging quote, because it suggests that we need to be thinking about, I need to be thinking about my everyday actions and how those everyday actions, particularly as an instructor, where I exercise some power over those who are a part of in my classrooms and so on. How is it that I might be a kind of mini tyrannical power, where my everyday practices are actually creating disadvantage and injustice? And that's really uncomfortable. That is really an uncomfortable notion, and I recognize that. And in this course, there are going to be a lot of kind of uncomfortable notions and moments where we need to step back from our own practices and think about them, and think about what it is that we might wish to become more conscious of and engage differently with. She talks then about, in thinking about this kind of oppression, the core value that's threatened by oppression is self-development. And is not self-development central to the educational undertaking? So from her perspective and the perspective of many others, oppression, exclusion, ways in which students are marginalized within our classrooms are very important for us to consider, because we are, in not considering it, we are potentially, at least, stymieing or standing in the way of self-development of the students in our classrooms. She then moves to talking about Young and her work and the dynamic and the way in which she takes up the dynamic and history of the isms, the sexism, racism, classism, and so on. And instead, while doing that, classifies oppression into 5 categories. And she does that by looking at the structural constraints that are placed on the self-development of social groups. And here we have Iris Young, who was, because she has since died, a philosopher and political theorist at City University of New York. Her work was has been highly quoted. You'll find her name listed often. And what she does is think then, how might we understand forms of oppression and what we might then do to act against it. So the forms that she talks about are cultural imperialism, systemic violence, marginalization, powerlessness, and exploitation, which is taken up less in the article, but I will talk about it just quickly as I conclude this this video. So what is it? How does it manifest? How can it be countered? First of all, cultural imperialism is the universalization of a dominant group's experience and culture and its establishment as the norm. When that happens, another group's perspective that is not the dominant group becomes invisible, while it is at the same time stereotyped. So that group then becomes the other of the dominant group. So, for example, to use the same example that we used before, curriculum that omits the Aboriginal perspective renders that group's perspective invisible and leaves it open then to the kind of stereotyping that has led to forms of oppression and violence that we find in our classrooms. The way in which the students decided to work against or to counter this form of oppression was to supplement the curriculum and critically analyze the omissions that existed. I'm not going to talk about each one of these in terms of what the findings were in the article. You'll find that in the article, but I just want to go through these just quickly. The second form is systemic violence, which is directed at members simply because they're members of that group. We've heard a lot in the news lately, however you might feel about it, about Black Lives Matter. And the whole notion around Black Lives Matter is that the belief and, pretty substantial evidence that that a particular portion of the population in the US has reason to live in fear of random and unprovoked attacks. And those attacks are meant to damage, humiliate, or destroy the person and to strike fear into the group. Another example would be gay bashing. So systemic violence is something that is a form of oppression that Young identifies. The third is marginalization, where we exclude social groups from useful participation in social life, including school. So English as a second language students, disabled students, there was a time, and in some cases continues to be a time, where those students are actually excluded from forms of schooling that are inclusive of them and their experience. Powerlessness, being in a position at the bottom of a hierarchy in which one must take orders but seldom give them, and are not able to exercise creativity or judgment in their work and do not command respect. So that would be an example, would be policies that limit student rights with no recourse to basic human rights of the person. Deirdre Kelly gives some good examples of that from BC, from Ontario, and so on, where powerlessness may be a part of a student's experience. Some parents feel a sense of powerlessness, for example. Sometimes teachers feel a sense of powerlessness. So we can think about examples within the educational system and what that means for leadership. Exploitation is, and this is the least, this arose least in the examples that were given. But exploitation is being in an unequal structural relation where the energy of the have-nots are continuously expended to maintain and augment the power, status, and wealth of the haves. The most egregious example would be slavery, and we have examples of slavery throughout the world, including in Canada. And so we have, this exists, and exists to our shame, I suppose, to a degree that's totally stunning. A colleague of mine, Lynette Schultz, did her doctoral dissertation on slavery, and I was part of the examining committee, and when I was reading this, I was just absolutely stunned. First of all, that I didn't know much about this whole phenomenon, and secondly, that it existed to the degree that it did, and thirdly, that it exists even in Canada. And that was a great surprise to me, and probably to many people. And perhaps this is something that we need to be paying attention to, and sometimes our students are actually, in a situation where they're very aware of this going on. So perhaps this needs to be a part of the conversation in their classrooms, as Kelly argues. So I've just gone really quickly through those 5, but in her article she talks it in more depth, and also talks about examples from those students' experience where they have countered these forms of oppression. So getting to the last bit, and this is our last slide, social justice. What I'm hoping we will do throughout the course is to move towards a growing and more rich definition of what social justice means. But at this point, based on the 2 readings that you've done, we can say that social justice means working towards inclusion and working against oppression. So it's a balance in terms of finding ways to work in both of these areas. Exclusion, working against oppression and exclusion in the policies and everyday practices of schooling. So I'm looking forward to your discussions in the forum and the ways in which you identify some examples of inclusion and exclusion, and think about practices that might be more inclusive and work against exclusion in your own everyday practices in schools. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to your responses throughout the course. And if you have any questions about any of the content here or anything else related to the course, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll be more than happy to respond to you as quickly as I can. Thanks for listening. I apologize for the length of this one. I promise all the rest will be shorter. Hopefully you've had a good little cup of tea beside you, or a big glass of wine or something, and as you've kind of gone through this, and I hope that this will serve as a good frame for your reading over the next few days. Take care.